This is a workshop on storytelling. Now, this is not your ordinary workshop. I don't want you to do any work. I want you to think, though. You see, I believe that storytelling can be simply what you make it. Oh, I know what the books say. Those books on the art and technique of storytelling, they're wonderful. You may be able to get a small bit of information from this one and that one, but let me tell you, when it all boils down, it's you, the person who tells the story, who must find that story and learn that story and tell it. Now, I'm here simply to give you a few shortcuts. 25 years of storytelling gives me that authority. I found storytelling because I remembered stories told by my grandfather. When I was just a little girl, I spent the first 6 years of my life with my grandfather, and he made stories come alive. My grandmother was very quiet. She didn't tell stories that you knew that she was telling. She kind of whispered to you, and nobody really knew that she was telling stories, but she could tell good ones. Now, I'd like to start off with just a little short story. This is a jack tale, and if I don't finish this jack tale, it's too bad. I'll finish it some other day. This is a tale about Jack at the very end of his life. Jack must have been, he was 99 years old. He lived with his daughter-in-law and his son and their children, Jack's grandchildren. Little children called him Grandpa Jack or Granddaddy Jack. He lived in the very same house he grew up in. Back in the days when Jack was a boy, it was a poor farm. And this is the end of Jack's life, and it's still poor. But Jack was trying to make that farm work. Every day he'd get up and he'd go out and he'd dig and he'd dig. They raised potatoes, little tiny potatoes. Never any more money than usual. Well, one day as Jack was digging out in the potato field, he heard the thunder, it seemed. And he looked up in the sky, but the sky was clear. The sun was shining. Couldn't have been thunder, but he could feel the earth moving. So he looked up the road, and there was this great cloud of dust. And then Jack saw what it was. It was the king's coach with 25 horses and 100 soldiers. And they were thundering down the road, and Jack rose from the instrument that he was breaking up the soil with. And he stood and he pulled his hand to his face and he saluted the king. And the king saw old man Jack and raised his hand in a kingly kind of way. And all of a sudden, as they rode by, even the soldiers saluted Jack. But as they rode by, the back of the king's coach opened and a great big box fell to the ground. Well, Jack tried to stop them. Oh, he said, wait. And the soldiers were saying, won't that old man stop waving? Yeah. And the king said, oh, yes. But they didn't understand that Jack was trying to stop them. So Jack went over and he opened the chest. It was filled with gold. Well, Jack thought the king, he must come back. But Jack looked around to see if anyone saw him open it. Nobody was there. So he dug a hole in the field, put the chest in the hole, and covered it up. Went home that night and didn't even tell his children about it. But he said to his grandchildren, would you like for Granddaddy Jack to go to school with you tomorrow? Well, the grandchildren thought that was wonderful. They had never had anybody like Jack at school. This would be wonderful. So Jack's son said, now, Daddy, what in the world are you going to school for? Oh, well, he said, I didn't do so well in school when I was a boy. I'm going to go and see what I can do now. Well, Jack went to school with his grandchildren. First thing, the teacher said, well, Granddaddy Jack, we're glad to have you here. Take a seat in the front. Oh, Jack said, well, thank you, ma'am. I believe I will. So she called on Jack. She said, we're going to give you an easy number to add. Jack said, all right. She said, now, if you listen to the problem, I'm sure you can put this together. She said, my mother gave me an apple. My mother kept an apple. When I returned home from school, she said, I didn't eat my apple. I still had it. My mother hadn't eaten hers. So we put them together on the table. How many apples did we have? And Jack said, you had an apple, and your mama had an apple. Both of you had an apple. She said, yes, but how many was it? Oh, he said it was enough for both of you. Well, she saw that Jack maybe couldn't add. She called on one of the children, and they raised their hands. Two. Oh, she said, that's right. Jack said, that's right. Well, it was time to spell, and she said, well, Granddaddy Jack, we're going to give you our easiest word. This animal or this insect buzzes, and it gets honey from flowers. What is it? Jack said, it's a bee. She said, that's right. Now, will you spell bee? Jack said, well, I guess I could spell it if I wanted to. But why don't you get one of the children to spell it? So she understood that Jack didn't spell, so she got one of the children to spell the word. And she said, well, why don't we go out for recess? Now, Jack did well at recess. He taught the children games, taught them how to play kick the can. That was his finest game. Oh, he taught them how to skip rocks across the river. Oh, good. Taught them how to shoot marbles. They had a good time, and the teacher just let Granddaddy Jack and all the children stay out and play. Well, Jack went home. Jack said, children, I had the best time at school. He said to his grandchildren, but I won't be going no more. Oh, they were so disappointed. Well, all right. Well, the rest of the time, Granddaddy Jack went out and he was digging in the fields from then on. About a month passed, and one day he heard this awful noise, sounded like thunder. Looked up the road, and sure enough, it was the king's coach. 100 soldiers and this big old coach. The king stopped and he said, who are you? Jack said, King, I'm Jack. I'm 99 years old. Oh, said the king, and you seem so bright. I'm bright, said Jack. I'm very bright. The king said, you know me? Jack said, yes, sir. Have you ever seen me before? Jack said, yes, sir. Saw you about a month ago. He said, you're coming down the road, and your coach opened up, and I tried to tell you, a big old chest fell out. The king said, what was in that chest? Jack said, it's full of gold. The king said, wonderful. He said, now, when did you say that was? Jack said, I remember well. It was the day before I went to school. The king said, I beg your pardon. Jack said, yeah, I remember well. It was the day before I went to school. The king said, how old did you say you were? I'm 99. The king said to his soldiers, this old man, he's kind of off in the head. We won't talk to him. You know he didn't see that. So the king said, well, I appreciate you thinking you saw my chest and my coach and my soldiers. He said, but I don't think you did. Well, what am I supposed to do with that chest? King said, well, you keep it. Jack said, thank you, sir. The king walked off across the field talking about, you believe that old man, see now, he just lost his mind. Jack went over, dug it up, drug it to the house, and they tell me that Jack and his son and his daughter-in-law and grandchildren living happily off that gold that the king gave them. That's a Jack tale. Now the Jack tales go on and on. They're from folks who pass them down. Now when you decide to find a story to tell, you don't have to go into those beautiful books you have in the library. You can find stories from your parents, your grandparents, the old man that lived down the road, from newspapers and magazines. There are stories all around you. And you never know when you're going to find one. Even in conversations every day, there's a story. But you have to keep your eyes and your ears open and think about it when you find it. Now, I know that because you work in the public schools, you come in contact with children. And there's something happened to our children, and I'm not so sure what really caused it. Some people say it's television. I don't know that. Television is a wonderful media, but sometimes it causes children to lose those communication skills. They don't listen. So therefore, it's very difficult to get them to be very creative. Have you ever had a child to write a story and he wrote about something he saw on television? He wrote about that great green Hulk, if that's what they write about nowadays, or some mechanical toy, the enforcers or the reinforcers or whatever that is that they talk about. They do those stories. They don't have an imagination. They've lost their imaginations. They don't listen. And sometimes they don't communicate the way you want them to communicate. Now, I know that there is a list that contains all of those things that will help children bring back those skills, those communication skills. A long list that teachers are given every year. And storytelling is probably at the very bottom of the list. Well, that's fine, because I know that there are so many things that teachers must do in school that learning a great long story, well, that would take a little more time than you have. But if you want to tell stories, believe it or not, if a child will listen to a story that you have to tell, you can teach them anything, because they will listen. Well, you're satisfied now. You think, all right, I want to tell a story. What's the first thing I should do? You have to find that story. You walk into the library. Now, I'm not getting on any librarians, because I came to storytelling by way of the library. But there were several things that I chose to do in the library. I set up a place called the Storytelling Collection. In this collection, there were books that hadn't been checked out since 1949. But they were bound in gold leaf, and they were beautiful. Or either the print was so small that you needed 2 magnifying glasses to see it. Now, remember, sort of stay away from those books that say Storytelling Collection. And be afraid to go in and say to the librarian, I'm getting ready to tell stories. Would you show me a book? Well, I was one of those librarians that would say, yes, I got one right here. It was a thick storybook with long stories. You don't have time to place all of those stories in your mind, those long stories. You need a short, quick stories because you don't have that much time with the students in the classroom or in the library. So you must put together a good story to, let's say, motivate reading or some creative venture that they would need to get some motivation for. You have to find that story. Settle down in front of 398.2 and look. Pull the book out, read a little bit of it, put it back, find something else. If that's not the case, settle down in front of the fiction. But you must look. You have to find that story on your own. Have you ever been in a department store? You're going to something very special, a party, and you need a very special dress. Well, you step into the department store and you say to the clerk, I'm going to a party. I need a dress. Would you find me one? And you try it on, see if I like it. Well, it's very difficult to do that to a story. This story you will have to tell. So finding it through the librarian, I want to tell a story. Find me a good book. You have to wear that. You have to find the story. Well, searching and finding, you must know. You pull that book from the shelf and you found it. Nice short story. Couple of paragraphs. I like this one. I'll use this one. Then you go about memorizing it. Ooh, once upon a time. Once upon a time. Once upon a time there lived. Once upon a time there lived. You're wasting your time. Never memorize a story word for word. Now, I'll tell you why. When I was a little girl, my Aunt Sally was the Christian education person in the church. Aunt Sally would give all the little children a recitation for Christmas, for Mother's Day, for Easter, and 'cause I was the cutest, she gave me the easiest. Every holiday. Today is Christmas. Merry Christmas. Today is Easter. Happy Easter. Today is Mother's Day. Happy Mother's Day. It was simple. Well, I'd go home and in the afternoons with my granddaddy, and he'd say your speech, gal. I'd stand up on the table. My grandmother would say, Lord have mercy, get that girl off that table. My granddaddy said she has to have a stage. So I'd stand up on the table. And he'd say it. And I'd say, today is Christmas. Merry Christmas. My granddaddy would say, that gal's going to be president. Well, on the Sunday, the day of the recitations, my Aunt Sally would say, now all you children go out and stand a few minutes in front of the crowd and let your grandpapas and your grandmamas see you. And I'd go out and I'd stand there. I'd stand a little longer than others. And my Aunt Sally would say, well, you go on. So I'd say, today is Christmas. And it never failed. Somewhere in the church, somebody would make a noise, drop a book, or the door would slam, preacher would clear his throat behind me, and I'd forget. And I'd say, Happy Easter. And my grandfather would say out loud, you reckon that gal's got good sense? Now, he's the one that said I was going to be president. Well, remember when you memorize that story? When little David and little Patricia says, oh, teacher, I got something to tell you. And you stop in the middle of that memorized story and say, yes, Patricia, what is it? My mama's going to have a baby. Oh, that's nice. Then you try to remember where you stopped. And then the two in the front said, oh, she forgot a story. Never memorize a story. I don't want you to memorize it. I want you to read that story 5 times. Do not commit it to memory. Now, the first time you read the story, I want you to make sure the story will fit the group that you want to tell the story to. Well, if you're a 2nd grade teacher, if you're a 1st grade teacher, you're an 8th grade teacher, you know exactly what your audience would like. I've got a friend that taught the 3rd grade for 35 years. And her husband said that she always brought the 3rd grade home with her. And I really never, knew what that meant. And one day I asked him, what do you mean she brings 36 children home with her? He said, no. He said, I have never learned my vocabulary words. And I said, well, what do you mean by that? Well, I'll say, could you pass me the potatoes? And she says, yes. Would you like some He said gravy. Say it. I know what the word is. And then he'd say I'd lose my shorts or my socks or something, and I'd say, which drawer did you put my socks in? And she'd say, the 3rd drawer. Just say it. She treats me like I'm a 3rd grader. Now, if you're good teachers, you know exactly what age group your audience will be, and you know how they think. So you know exactly whether that story will fit your audience. And I want you to think about your audience. Now, librarians have a hard time because they have from kindergarten through 8th grade that they must prepare for. That's all right, because any story they pick out, they'll know if the 1st graders will be able to use it, or the 3rd graders, or the 4th graders. So I don't worry about the librarians so much. The first time you read it, you know for sure what group you're working with. You know that group will like it. But do you like it? Don't ever tell a story that you don't like. But it's Christmas. And I must have a Christmas story. I don't like this one so much. It's kind of sugary sweet. But it's a Christmas story. Tell a good Halloween story. It will go over better. Don't tell a story that you were forced, because you've wasted all of that time learning that story, and you'll never tell it again because you didn't like it. So just put in some other holiday. They won't know the difference. Now, sometimes when we get to that second reading, we get a little confused. The second time you read that story, we read it strictly for the pictures. But you said it was 2 paragraphs long. What pictures? These are the pictures that I want you to create as storytellers. So as you read that story, read pictures. See your characters. Don't be afraid to give the characters faces and personalities. Don't be afraid to see the scenes in the stories. What does the woman look like? Oh, she looks like your coworker. Or the man. Oh, he looks like your principal. The little girl, she looks like your niece, the one with the dimples. And the little boy in the story, oh, he's the little boy that throws the glove into the aquarium. And you say, how'd that get in there? I don't know. Be sure you see these characters. And if you can visualize these characters, you know exactly what they'll do in the story. Don't be afraid to see them. Make your own pictures. The third time you read the story, this is a very important place in the story. This is the place where you walked into the department store and asked the clerk to try on the dress. Well, you decided that was not right. So you decided to try the dress on. You like it. It fits. But it's too long. You need to hem it. Too big. You need to make some tucks. This is the place where we hem and tuck the story. We are working with the words of the story. Very important place. Remember the story collection where the books had not been checked out since 1949? Be careful. There are some fairy tales in this world that are wonderful tales, but the images and some of the words are obsolete. Remember, we are working with very sophisticated children because of television and technology. They know things for a little different, like the word that they use for relief, Rolaids. How do you spell relief? You spell it Rolaids. So some stories give different images. Words have changed. Terms have changed. Be careful. Working with a group of children in Atlanta, Georgia once, I was telling Diane Walkstein's story to Pingy. It's in The Magic Orange Tree and Other Haitian Tales. And the housekeeper was not the housekeeper. It was the old stepmother. We don't use that term anymore. The housekeeper saw the stranger and asked the stranger to bring the wood into the house. And the stranger said, "Sure, I will, but I must be paid." So the old woman paid him with a wooden box. And when she gave him the wooden box, he opened it, and there was something white inside. So he tasted to see what it was. Well, back in the back of the room, these are second graders, I heard a little voice say, "It was cocaine." I had never seen cocaine. I didn't know that's what it was. But in the story, it was a salt box. But these children had never seen salt in a box, but salt in a shaker. And I thought, oh, that's the way that worked. And then once, a good friend of mine, a fellow storyteller, and I went into a classroom. We were asked to tell Southern tales and fairy tales. And my friend chose the story, The Old Witch and the Faggots. Well, you know what happened there. The word is not the same. It does not mean today firewood as it did then. We should have changed the word, the old witch and the firewood. Think about the images as you read the story. Think about how many stepmothers we have. And if we make these stepmothers in the story wicked stepmothers, how many children may go home and kick their mothers on the leg? You're the wicked stepmother. Be careful about the terms. Notice the tales that you are telling. Are there words that have changed? Terms that have changed? Images that perhaps change? There was once upon a time, I was telling stories in the northern part of the United States and happened to run into a group of witches. And they were picketing because they said I was unfair to witches. But you see, that's what was in the story. The witches were mean, angry, hateful, deceitful. But these women said that they are not that way. Well, I'm sure they aren't. And I'm sorry, but that's in the story. That's something I don't choose to change. That's why I say think about it. You know, if you want to stay true to the story, that's fine. But what image are you giving? As long as I live, witches will be evil and mean and hateful in these stories. I'm waiting on the giants to come after me now. Sometimes you can't change the words in a story. For instance, the story Sodi Saleratus. What in the world is that? Define the term. Don't linger on it. Just define the term and move along quickly. The word Sodi Saleratus. Well, during the days the pioneers were crossing America, they placed salt and soda, a baking powder together, and they mixed it up. And when they settled down to make biscuits, it was all mixed together so that extra weight, you didn't have to carry an extra tin for your salt and your soda. Well, now, that's Sodi Saleratus. And go on. The old man wore a long pair of red galluses. What are galluses? Galluses and, well, they're very close to your pants. Galluses button and other things snap. It's easily and sometimes storytellers bring to their group galluses to show that they snap onto your britches, as Jack would say. Sometimes the words should not be changed. The word Sodi Saleratus is an important part of folklore. Use it. Define it quickly. I don't think you need vocabulary words. When you approach the word in the story, talk about it and move on. The fourth time you read your story, put your words and your pictures together. Now, the fourth time you read, how do you remember that these are my pictures and these are my stories? Write it down. Now, it's real hard to copy a story from a book. Oops, that's bad. But if you're going to copy this story, copy the story 3 times. One time, the first copy you have, this is your personal copy. Put it in a notebook of stories. You will not use this, but this is a listing of your stories. This stays on your shelf. You don't lend it out. You keep it because you never know when that book will not be in the library anymore. It's been discarded. Or you won't be able to find that book anymore. But if you want the story again, you have it. The second copy, that's a working copy. You use that to scratch out those words that you don't want to use, those terms, and you add to the list there. Or either you make drawings. This is the way the man looks. This is the way the woman character looks. This is the way the little boy. You make all of those in the margins and the workings of your page. The third copy, that's your final copy, your words and your pictures. And here again, this goes into your notebook. That second one can be discarded. You don't need that anymore. The third one, the first one and the third one, these are the ones you use. These are the ones you keep. The fifth time may be 2 minutes after you've read it the fourth time. It could be 20 years after you've read that story the fourth time. I used to tell a story called Soldier Jack. It's about Jack tying up death and leaving it in a sack for 600 years. And I thought how wonderful that would be. Everybody could live to be 600 years old. You can see grandchildren and your great-great-grandchildren. And then I watched somebody in my family with cancer. And I heard them saying, if death would just come to me today. And I thought, it's impossible for you to live that long. You shouldn't even want to live past your time. The quality of life is not the same. You have probably outlived your pension. And now when I tell that story, 20 years later, it's altogether different. You see, when you read that story the first time, and you read that story the fifth time, there's a bit of wisdom that's come in to your understanding of that story. So you'll tell it differently. You will see the characters altogether different. Now I understand why it was so easy for Jack to go and find death. When he finally looked around him and saw that life was so low, he decided it's time to take death from that sack. I understood it, and I tell it in a different way. That fifth reading, read that straight script, the first story that you read from the book, not yours, because you may have missed something, or there may have been some bit of wisdom that you learned from the first to the fifth reading that you'll need to add to your telling now. You're ready to tell. You pull your chair in front of your group and you say, I have a story to tell today. And as you tell the story, those little faces look up and those little eyes and minds are lost totally in that story. And you see that they see Jack and they see everything that you're telling. And then somebody, when you say, and that's the end of that, one of them will say, hey, would you tell that again? Give yourself an A. And then you say, you hear, I like that. Is that in a book? Can I read the book? Give yourself an A+. You've got to read it. Do you have questions about finding stories and putting them together? Now, if I don't have the answer, I'll make up one.
What about dialect in stories?
Well, I do the Brer Rabbit tales a lot. My grandparents spoke wonderful dialect, but I can't. And the children that we're dealing with today wouldn't understand it. I can read those stories, but it's difficult for me to understand some of the things that they're saying. So I read them over and over again and put them in regular English, and I throw in a bit of dialect here and there. I explain to them that this is the dialect of the slave. But you must remember the slave mimicked what he heard his master speaking. So you must include the whole scene if you tell any of it. Explain it. I don't mind because you're white that you tell the Uncle Remus stories. It was a white man that compiled the stories in the beginning in a book. It was a long time before any black writers wrote down the stories in dialect. But the folklorists did get them together, the black folklorists. But dialect is not understood, black dialect is not understood too much, the slave dialect, let's say. And there's a lot of criticism about the slave dialect because it wasn't quite right. But Joel Chandler Harris wrote what he thought he heard. So we'll forgive him for that because he put the stories in dialect. But what about the Irish dialect? If you can't do it, leave it alone. You ruin the story, any dialect. If you can't do it, if you can't hear it, I'm going to the Gullah Festival because I love the Gullah dialect, but I'm not going to try to do it. It's very difficult, but I like to hear the Gullah storytellers tell it. And I have tried to tell it, but it's very difficult. All the practice in the world, if you cannot quite get that dialect, don't try it. Another question.
How about props?
Well, props get in my way. My props are my hands and my face and my eyes and my gestures, my body movement. It's fine to use props, but remember, if you have anything that's too gimmicky, it doesn't work. I know one storyteller that uses magic tricks, and I have watched those tricks not work, and the children laughed. I have watched those things embarrass her. Props are fine. In order to explain Sodi Saleratus, a box of arm and hammer would be fine. In order to show what the old pirates put down in their ships to keep them balanced, a balance stone, a great big round river rock would just be the thing, and the children would like to touch it. If you play an instrument, do use it with your storytelling and music, but beware. Too much music in a story makes the children say, oh no, she's not gonna sing again, is she? Too much music just really kills your story. If you have a puppet, beware that while you're telling the story, that puppet takes on a real quality, and the children will want to pet it, and they'll start petting the puppet and talking to the puppet and won't hear your story. So if the puppet can hide after he comes out, and presents himself, fine. Just don't let him stay there and get petted. Another question. Well, now, I want you to remember that as you tell stories, sometimes the story seems, the children look at you as if, I don't understand that. Feel at home enough to stop and say, that's not a good story for you today. I have another one. My English teacher used to tell me that my strength was in reading an audience. This may not be the day that your children need to hear about John Henry. Or this may not be the day that they want to hear about Jack. And when you get into Jack, and they don't want to hear it, because you can tell when they turn you off. Or they just turn around. Change and explain. I've got another one I think I'd like to tell you. Fine. Well, what about ghost stories? What about scary stories? By all means. When I was 3 years old, my grandfather scared me to death. My grandmother would say, get up on your granddad's lap and kiss him good night. And I'd throw my arms around him. I'd say, I'm going to bed. And he'd say, it's dark up there. And I'd say, well, I know. You know what's in the dark? No. Monsters. My grandfather was sending me to my bed, to my death. I'd say, what will the monsters do? They'll drag you off to bed, put you in the keyhole. Well, that was the beginning of my yelling and screaming going up the stairs, and my grandmother would say, Jim, you've got that gal's mouth gapped open again. And my grandmother would tell me on the way up the steps, will you stop crying? There's not a keyhole big enough to put you in. So I remained fat for the rest of my life. That's why, no monsters have bothered me. I love scary stories. Now, I have run into many parents who say, oh no, don't tell my children any scary stories. Children frighten themselves. And it's a special thing. It's a rite of passage. They love scary stories. Even little ones who don't even understand the abstract term ghost and spirit. Tell me a scary story. They want to hear a scary story. Now, for little folk, I tell stories that end like my Tilly story. It was just a game that Tilly played every night with this thing that came up the stairs. It was just a game. But now, when I get into the older ones, it was a ghost. And it was trying to get in the closet after them. But it took whatever it was looking for and ran away. And they say, phew, tell that one again. And if they're even older than that, the ghosts and the spirits tell the stories about North Carolina or the place where you live, the stories of folklore. North Carolina is just filled with wonderful ghost stories. From the mountains to the sea, all of those great stories. The one I like best of all is the one about the headless brakeman in Mako Station. Oh, I tell that all over the world. And I've got people going to Mako from Europe coming to see that headless man. They believed it. I'm pretty good for tourism. But they believe those wonderful stories. I believe that if you don't show them that there are frightening things in this world, but you have the security of your mother and your father and your teachers and all the people who love you, you don't have to worry. That's why you tell these stories. That must be exercised when they're small. If you don't do it, if parents don't do it, it comes out later on. And it may not be so good. I love ghost stories. The story that I'd like to tell you now, well, it's not so much a ghost story as it is what they call a jump tale. It's Danish. It's about a little boy and a little girl, Mary and Michael, and they were little children, and they played together all the time. And one day Michael said to Mary, they were in the sandbox, and Michael said to Mary, that's a pretty dress you've got on. And Mary said, thank you. He said, could you tell me why you have a yellow ribbon tied around your neck? And she said, no, I can't tell you. Okay, he said. They grew up. They were on the playground at school, elementary school. And Mary was swinging, and Michael was pushing her in the swing. And he said, Mary, you look real pretty today. And Mary said, thank you, Michael. He said, can I ask you a question? She said, yes. He said, why do you have that yellow ribbon tied around your neck? She said, I can't tell you. He said, okay. They were in junior high. They were in the library looking at a book together. National Geographic magazine. And Michael looked over at Mary and he said, that's a pretty color nail polish you got on. Oh, she said, thank you. It belongs to my mama. He said, well, it's pretty. Can I ask you a question? She said, what is it? Why do you have a yellow ribbon tied around your neck? Oh, she said, I can't tell you. Okay, he said. They were in high school. They were getting ready to graduate. Caps and gowns, and they looked so good. It was the last time they'd probably see each other, but Michael said, Mary, he said, it's been a long time, all through school. He said, I liked you so much. And he said, you look real pretty tonight. And she said, thank you. He said, tell me something. She said, what? Why do you have that yellow ribbon tied around your neck? She said, oh, I can't tell you. College. Well, one day, they were seated on the lawn. They were having lunch together. And Michael had just proposed to Mary, and she had accepted. And she was looking at her ring. And she said, this is so wonderful. He said, now that we're engaged, can I ask you a question? She said, yes. He said, why do you have that yellow ribbon tied around your neck? She said, after we're married, I'll tell you. It was their wedding day. Oh, she was an angel in white. He was so proud of himself. Oh, he was handsome. Michael and Marie, at long last, were getting married. She came down the aisle and stood beside her groom. And when the veil was lifted, he said, oh, you're so beautiful. She said, thank you. He said, why do you have that yellow ribbon around your neck? She said, I'll tell you after we're married. They were married for almost 50 years. Their children had children. And their children's children had children. And they were old. And they were seated on the front porch one day. Michael said, Marie, we've had a wonderful life together. Marie said, yeah, we did. He said, I've asked you this question at least 1,000 times. Got the same answer every time. He said, I'm going to ask it one more time. I would love to get an answer. She said, Michael, what is it? He said, why do you have that yellow ribbon around your neck? She said, well, Michael, we've known each other for a long time. We've been married for 50 years, and our children have children, and their children have children. Ain't no need of me answering that question now. She said, but I'll tell you what. I'll show you why I keep this yellow ribbon around my neck. He said, let's see it. With shaky hands, she went toward the ribbon, and she grabbed each end of the ribbon and she pulled slowly. And as she pulled the ribbon, her head fell off. And that's the end of that. You've been good listeners, and I thank you for listening.